Hello, I am Holly Sinclair, and today I will be discussing Kohlberg's theory of moral development. There are a few areas that I want to cover today. I will talk about Kohlberg, who he was, the 3 levels of moral development, the 6 stages of moral development, the method that was used for evaluation, the criticisms of a few of the criticisms of this theory, and then some questions for you to consider. So first, who was Lawrence Kohlberg? Well, Lawrence Kohlberg was an American psychologist who lived from 1927 to 1987. He was a professor at the University of Chicago and later at Harvard. He studied the works of Piaget, and he wanted to further expound upon the more specific area of the moral development. Piaget kind of broadly focused on several areas of child development, and Lawrence Kohlberg wanted to go a little bit more deeply into specifically the moral development of children. And Lawrence Kohlberg has an interesting quote about morals. He said, "Morality is the ability to see an issue from points of view other than your own." So that was his definition of morality, and he took that, and that is kind of the framework in which he built his theory. So first, we see there are three levels in this theory of moral development: the pre-conventional level, the conventional level, and the post-conventional level. Now, by conventional, what Kohlberg is talking about is conforming to the conventions of society. And so that would be kind of the standard, being conventional. And then if someone has not quite reached that level and they're pre-conventional, that would come first. And after someone kind of starts thinking a little bit more deeply and maturing more, then we would say they are post-conventional. And this is a progression. You would go from pre-level 1 to conventional, and then to post-conventional. You would move in this fashion. And to really understand the moral development more closely, he took these 3 levels and broke them down into stages. There are 6 stages, 2 stages for each level. So there's 3 and then 2 in each for a total of 6. So I have the 6 stages here, and you see I have them bracketed to show that each pairing here goes into one of the levels. So in the first level, the pre-conventional level, there are 2 stages. The first being the obedience punishment stage. In this stage, children's sense of morality is based solely upon obedience and punishment. Rules are fixed. If you break the rules and get punished, then that's wrong. And if you don't get punished, if you don't get in trouble, then it was right. And so really very black and white. Then as a student, moral development begins to be more developed, begins to grow and mature, they're going to start to see that rules can sometimes be arbitrary, and they're going to start to be concerned more about individualism and exchange, about what's doing right for them and possibly working around rules or exchanging things to get what they want. This would be pre-conventional. Then as we go to conventional level, we have 2 stages here. Stage 3 is the stage that is good, where children are concerned with good interpersonal relationships. And so their morality is going to be based upon being viewed as a good boy or a good girl, what those around them will think. And this is interesting to those of us who work with older children or teenagers, and we see that their relationships is really the most important thing to them, and they're so affected by peer pressure. And so we see that this even is to the extent that it affects their morality. Their sense of right and wrong is really determined by how it's going to affect the way that others view them and their relationships with those around them. Then as they progress to stage 4, and then we're getting a little bit older, this is where even a lot of adults kind of hang out right in this area, is focusing on maintaining social order. So obeying the laws and having that understanding that if nobody obeyed the laws and there was anarchy, the kind of problems that could create. And so that would be the conventional level and those 2 stages. And Kohlberg did state that lots of people kind of reach this level and don't ever progress any further. Then the next stage here would be stage 5, the social contract and individual rights. And this is where someone may start to question the laws and the society and say, what is more important, And we see there have been times where people have said that they start to question the laws because they say individual rights aren't being protected or aren't being given the way that they need to be. And so those people would say their moral development is on stage 5. Then stage 6, which Kohlberg said very few people reach, is where people are guided by universal principles of what is ultimately just and what is right. And in doing research, the name that often is discussed at this level is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. because he was so guided by his principles that he was willing to go against much of the culture, and he was willing to go against the laws and against society because he believed in what was right, and he had a very strong sense of morality and believed in these universal principles. And so these would be the 6 stages of Kohlberg's theory. Now, what's really interesting is how he determined which stage people were at. So the methods he used here, he interviewed 72 boys in the Chicago area, and he would interview them at 3-year intervals every 3 years for a total of 20 years. So did a lot of research here with these boys. And starting out, he had a variety of ages, and then as they aged, he would continue interviewing them. He would present the boys with moral dilemmas, which were stories that ended with a question about what should have happened or if what happened was right or wrong. And so the interesting thing is that Kohlberg wasn't super interested in whether or not they said it was right or wrong. He was really interested in the reasoning. 2 boys could say that when told the story that what happened was wrong. They could both say that was wrong, he should not have done it, it was a mistake. And yet one could be classified as being on level 1, and the other boy could be classified as being on level 4, based on the reasoning that they gave to support their answer. So that's really what he was looking at and analyzing, was the thought process. Now, the most famous dilemma that he gave was the Heinz dilemma. And this is variations of the story are readily available on the internet. I'll briefly kind of summarize it for you. So, Heinz is a man in Europe who has a wife who's dying of cancer. She's very sick. There is a pharmacist who has a medicine. He has created this medicine, and he is selling this medicine that will cure Heinz's wife. And so Heinz goes to the pharmacist to get the medicine. But the medicine is very expensive. It was expensive to create, and then the pharmacist has marked it up quite a bit. He's going to make a very large profit from this. And so Heinz can't afford it, and so he goes to all of his friends and family and charities and raises all the money that he can. And he goes back to the pharmacist, and he's only able to get half of what is needed. So he goes to the pharmacist and asks, can I have it for a lesser price, or may I leave this as a down payment and continue to make payments but get this medicine to help my wife? She really needs it. And the pharmacist says, no, this is the price I have set. This is my property. I'm not willing to work with you. Come back when you have more money. So that evening, when the pharmacist leaves, Heinz breaks into the pharmacy and steals the drug that he needs so that his wife can live. The question is, did Heinz do the right thing? Was it right to steal? Now, the boys would have different answers, of course. Yes, it was right, or no, it was wrong. But then they would explain why. So let's just, for an example, briefly look at maybe a few of the different possibilities. Again, their answers and reasoning could change, but these would be kind of the outlines we're looking at. Someone in stage 1, a young boy in stage 1 might say it's wrong to steal because you go to jail. He would be talking about that punishment. In stage 2, the boy might say, no, it's right to steal because he really needed it. And as an individual, it's what he needed, and he was willing to exchange for it, so he did the right thing. In stage 3, the boy's going to start thinking about the relationship that Heinz has with the people he knows and wanting to be seen as a good person. So he might say people would think he was a terrible person if he didn't try to save his wife, and his wife's the most important person, so he has to do all he can to save her, and so that people know he's a good person. And then in stage 4, they might say that it was wrong to steal because the social order and the law says, it's against the law to steal. And if you steal, there's a punishment. And if everybody stole, then that would be chaos and anarchy. And so they might really be kind of focusing on the law and the social order there. In stage 5, they would start talking about the individual rights. And so, again, they could give yes or no, but if they're bringing up these individual rights, they might talk about the right to life trumps this man's right to his property and his desire for profit. And they might say that, that Hines had the right to steal because it was morally right because of his rights as an individual to provide life and happiness for his wife. In stage 6, an individual would start to talk about not what's acceptable, not what's necessary, but just what is just, what is right, kind of removing all of these things. Just looking at, here's a person who's dying, here's a person who has a way to help them, what is the right thing to do, what is just, and what did Hines do, and was he really obeying the universal principle? Again, the individual answering the question could say yes or no and still be classified as any of these based on his reasoning. And so that's the Hines dilemma that was used very often as kind of the most well-known. And so this is how Kohlberg did his research and collected his information and said that these levels do exist, and the 6 stages do exist, and they are a progression. He said that children do not jump from, they're not going to go from 1 to 3 without passing through 2. They're going to move along in this progression. And he also talked about helping students or children progress by presenting them with these moral dilemmas, maybe just beyond where they're at right now. So they really have to stop and think and kind of helping them become a more empathetic person, somebody who sees things from others' points of view. So interesting things to think about. Now, there were some criticisms of Kohlberg's theory. 2 criticisms we'll point out. One is that only boys were studied, and so Carol Gilligan, one of Kohlberg's students, said that that was a problem and that girls were socialized differently and their moral development was going to be different as well. A lot of research kind of refutes what she said, but it is an interesting thing to think about and notice that he did only interview boys and only kind of got this research of boys. And so does that really, does that have an effect on it? Does gender play a role there? Also, there are others who said the theory seems to favor Western worldviews. The idea of individualism and individual rights is much more a Western idea. Jay Snary is one who kind of pointed out that in other parts of the world, specifically in Eastern cultures, we see a much more collectivist idea. And so when we get into higher levels, somebody might be more morally developed or more, have higher level thinking here, but they're still going to come back to that idea of society because that's their deeply held belief. They really believe that it is sometimes necessary to sacrifice individual rights or needs for the good of this society. And so there are some critics who say there are some problems with those higher levels and the way they're structured in thinking about the individual and thinking about justice. There are some interesting criticisms, good things for us to think about as we look at these stages and these theories. So I have some questions for you to consider. I would love for you to leave some comments and participate in a discussion. So number 1 would be, do morals transcend cultures? Level 6 really talks about this universal principle. Is that a real thing? Are there universal principles that all humans hold, that all things are just and right? Do we have any kind of evidence to support that? Number 2, does moral thinking necessarily lead to moral behavior? Kohlberg, as a psychologist, was really interested in the thought process that these children were having. Those of us who are in a classroom every day with students, we are concerned with how our students are thinking, but we might be a little bit more concerned with their actions if they're really living out this moral behavior. So does helping them think morally necessarily mean that they're going to act more morally in a more morally developed way? So that's an interesting question to think about as well. And then number 3, how can this theory help those of us who work with children? If we consider these levels of development and the 6 stages of moral development, and that it's hypothesized and theorized that we can help our students to become more morally developed, how can I use that as an educator? How can that help me? How can that help my students? So these would be some interesting things that I would love to read some of your comments and feedback on, if you have any comments or feedback. I thought this was a really interesting topic, and I did some research here. I'm going to put a document with links, and you can look up any of the information you like. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.